everybody. How nice to see all you Oz fans. My name is Angelica Shirley Carpenter, and I'm a former president of the Oz Club. I'm on the board of directors now, and I've spent a lifetime writing about Oz. So I want to thank everybody at OzCon for inviting me to speak today. And, you know, it seemed kind of lonely just to have me, a talking head, and a PowerPoint. So I invited some friends of mine from the Oz Club to be the live audience. I don't know if you can be a live audience when you're recorded, but they're a lively group anyway. So I think I will have them introduce themselves to you now and tell you a little bit about where they are, what they do when they're not doing Oz, and how they're involved with the club. So Gina, would you like to start?
Okay, I will. I'm Gina Wickwar, and I am the recording secretary of the International Wizard of Oz Club, and I've been doing that for quite a long time. But I'm also the author of 2 Oz books, one, The Hidden Prince of Oz, the other, Total of Oz. And I'm working on a 3rd one, and Joel Harris is beating me on the back, figuratively, from his computer. And I've been in the Oz Club for, since I think about 1965. And I love it, and I've loved Oz all my life too. And what do I do when I'm not doing Oz? I don't think anyone's doing very much with nowadays, but I go and fill my car with gas and I buy groceries. Woo!
Well, thank you for coming in. Hi, Vincent. Her husband's in the background there. He's her technical assistant.
Hi.
Okay, so Bill, you're next.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Bill Thompson. I'm on the board of directors for the International Wizard of Oz Club as well. And I'm also the auctioneer for the club. We won't have any auctions this summer, which is a bummer. But I'm also the author of Bibliographia Baumiana, which is a follow-on to Bibliographia Oziana, covering L. Frank Baum's non-Oz books.
Thank you. Scott?
I am Scott Cummings, and I'm in Chicago, Illinois. Past editor of the Baum Bugle, and I currently sit on the board of directors of the Oz Club. And by day, I'm a chemistry professor.
Welcome. Nancy?
My name is Nancy Tystad-Kopel, and I am presently the head of the Pioneer Girl Project, which is a project about Laura Ingalls Wilder. My claim to Oz fame, I guess, is that I edited and annotated L. Frank Baum's satirical newspaper column, Our Landlady, in 1996. And that's it, I guess. My connection with the Oz Club is mostly that I've been a member for at least 20 years. So.
And she's my publisher too.
I forgot about that.
A wonderful,
that's you today, I'm sure.
That's a wonderful role, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. Okay, Sarah.
I'm Sarah Krotzer. I am the current editor of the Baum Bugle. I have been since 2018, and I've been a Oz Club member since 1990. And I live just outside of Nashville, Tennessee, where I teach English and film.
Well, thank you all for joining me, and what an erudite audience you are. But I know you're all very encouraging, and plus I know that some of you are really silly. So I'm not worried, you know. I'm going to now attempt to start my PowerPoint. And audience, if you have any questions or comments, you can just join right along, okay?
Okay.
So today I want to introduce you to Matilda Joyslyn Gage. And why is that? Well, she was L. Frank Baum's mother-in-law. But we'll get to that later. For now, it's good to know that she was an early leader in the women's rights movement for decades, and that she worked very closely with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. But Matilda died first of the three of them, and the other two wrote her out of history. So with my book, which is called Born Criminal, I'm trying to write her back in. Now, Matilda herself gave me the name for this book because one night in, let's see, when 1893, a deputy sheriff knocked on her door in Fayetteville, New York, and he had come to arrest her. And she said, all the crimes of which I was not guilty rushed through my mind, but I failed to remember that I was a born criminal, a woman. So what was her crime? She registered to vote. And she was found guilty, and she appealed that ruling, and she lost the appeal too. So she was born criminal. Matilda was born in 1826 in Cicero, New York, which is near Syracuse. And she was born just a year after the Erie Canal opened. So it was a time of great prosperity for central New York as the canal brought a lot of new settlers. But they did have a tendency to, sorry, I'm not going anywhere with this. Oh, there it is. They did have a tendency to displace the old settlers, which were the members of the American Indian nations that lived there, the Onondaga, mostly right around Syracuse. However, they didn't displace them all, and many Indians still do live in that area. And as Matilda was growing up, she came to really admire the Indian practice of democracy in which women had rights equal to those of men, unlike in United States society. Matilda's father was a doctor, and she was his medical assistant. And from a very young age, she would ride on horseback with him to treat patients. Her mother was, she wanted to be a doctor like her father. Matilda's mother was well educated for the time, and she taught her daughter to love history. And Matilda especially liked to read about famous women in history. The Joyslyn home in Cicero was a stop on the Underground Railroad. They had the nicest home in Cicero. And it was a gathering place for intellectuals. So Matilda's father expected his only child to be included in absolutely every conversation. And if she asked a question, it was to be answered respectfully. And she could stay up as late as she wanted.
Yay.
At a young age, Matilda learned that in European cultures, organized religion considered women inferior to men. She did not believe what she was taught in church, which was that women had brought sin into the world, or one woman had brought sin into the world, and thus was the source of all evil. And if you look at this picture, even the snake is a woman. She also could not understand why so many churches, even in New York, supported slavery. As a teenager, she became interested in women's rights, especially when she was refused admission to medical school because she was a woman. Or what I should say is she was interested in their lack of rights. Women were banned from higher education in most professions, and that was even women who needed to work in order to live. They could not vote, speak in public, serve on juries, or testify in court, even against rapists, for example. Married women could not own property or sign contracts. Any money they owned or inherited belonged to their husbands, who could beat them, starve them, rape them, lock them up in insane asylums or jails, or turn them out with nothing. If a marriage ended, the man got the children. That was the end of that discussion. But if a single woman owned land, she had to pay taxes on it. Well, instead of becoming a doctor, Matilda married a storekeeper, Henry Gage, who was quite a liberal, the same as she was. This is the earliest picture I have of her at about age 24, and she's with her son, Clarkson. And you notice how she has this kid in a headlock, because this was a time when exposures were very long for photographs, probably a whole minute. So she's making sure he holds still. And you notice that boys, well, you can't see his hair real well, but he's wearing a dress. That's what they wore. Well, on July 19th, 1848, which was the very day after that little boy was born, the first Women's Rights Convention took place in Seneca Falls, New York, which was just 50 miles away from where Matilda lived. But of course, she wasn't able to attend. About 300 people, mostly women, but some men, met in a church that is now part of the Women's Rights National Historical Park. And they passed a declaration that said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." The convention was organized by Lucretia Mott, who was a very well-known Quaker abolitionist, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a radical young writer who lived in Seneca Falls. And Stanton submitted a resolution urging women to seek the right to vote. And this was so controversial, it almost didn't pass. People were afraid that it would just bring ridicule to the women's movement if they said they should vote. But with the help of Frederick Douglass, Stanton got it passed, although not unanimously like the other conference resolutions. Well, as I said, Matilda couldn't attend, but the conference made headlines, and she was an avid newspaper reader. And she began at this time to cut out articles about women and to paste them into, well, I don't know if she pasted them in right then, but eventually either she or her daughter Maud pasted them into this old ledger book. And you can see the writing underneath the articles. And this scrapbook is now in the Library of Congress. And it's so much fun to read, and she's underlined things, or sometimes she crosses something out and writes no. So it's just fun to see what she did with it. So we know she read about that convention. Here's the outfit that Matilda wore to her very first women's rights convention in Syracuse in 1852. It was Susan B. Anthony's first convention too. She had been involved in the temperance movement until she went to a meeting for the temperance movement and learned that women were not allowed to speak there. So she walked out the door and walked over to the women's rights movement. Now, a young activist named Lucy Stone spoke at this meeting. Here she is wearing what they call a reform dress. Some people call this bloomers. They wore these. Matilda never did wear bloomers, but many of the others did.
Those look like pants, not bloomers.
Well, I know, but that's a bloomer. They called it a bloomer costume.
Really?
Don't ask me why. I mean, she just looks like she stuck a skirt on over her pants, but
Yeah.
anyway, some people wore these. Stanton had a black satin bloomer outfit. Susan B. Anthony had a pink dotted Swiss bloomer outfit. I wish we could have seen that. But Matilda never did wear the bloomer outfit. They wore them for about 2 years until the outfits were just so distracting. For instance, the women were stoned when they walked down the street. They felt like it was distracting from the movement, so they pretty much gave it up. But anyway, Lucy Stone did wear the reform dress to this first meeting in Syracuse. The meeting was chaired by Lucretia Mott, and Matilda didn't know anything about meetings or conventions. None of these women did. They'd never been to one, and women weren't supposed to speak. But Matilda had written a speech, and so when she got brave enough to do it, she walked up to the front, and Lucretia Mott saw her and realized how nervous she was and invited her very kindly to speak. So Matilda's speech made a sensation. Instead of talking about what women might do if they were given a chance, she instead talked about what famous women had already done. And her audience was amazed, and they said, well, why haven't we learned about these things? So it was such a good speech that Lucretia Mott moved that it be published, and it was. And very soon after that, Matilda began public speaking. So it's not clear when Matilda met Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They both had babies quite a bit, so Stanton couldn't go to that 1852 meeting in Syracuse because she was having a baby that time. But eventually they met and they became close friends, and the three of them, Matilda, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, all lived in central New York. Pretty soon, Matilda began traveling and circulating petitions wherever she went. And she traveled to conventions, even though it was considered wrong for a woman to travel alone. So restaurants wouldn't serve them, hotels wouldn't let them stay there. So they had to pack lunches and find boarding houses with sympathetic owners. And they had to carry two petitions, one petition for equal rights and the second one for suffrage, because some people would sign the first one, but not the second, because the idea of suffrage was still so controversial. In 1854, the Gage family moved to Fayetteville, which is still a suburb of Syracuse now. And they made their house a stop on the Underground Railroad, the way Matilda's parents had done. Henry had a store in Fayetteville that was just down the hill from their house. It was on the same street. He was very proud of Matilda, and the fact that his store did so well allowed him to support Matilda as she traveled and went to speak at conventions. Here's Matilda in what's called a spoon bonnet. She was always very stylish. And she's about 35. She had a baby girl, Maud. Nobody knows if Maud ever had a middle name. This was her fourth and last child, about 2 weeks before the Civil War began. So during the war, the women's movement suspended meetings, and they worked to support the Union cause. After the war, Susan B. Anthony on the right and Elizabeth Cady Stanton started a newspaper called The Revolution, and Matilda became one of its primary writers. So many groups had worked together to pass the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery. And Matilda and her colleagues hoped that the same coalition could work together to get women able to vote. But with the passage of the 14th Amendment, which said only men could vote, first time it really spelled that out in the Constitution, and the 15th Amendment, it became clear that the public did not care about the voting rights of women, whatever color they were, and that African American men were set to get the vote first before any women did. So this was very sad. And in 1869, the women's movement split in half over this issue. Matilda, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony wanted a constitutional amendment, and they wanted it right now so that all women could vote. But while Matilda stuck with Stanton and Anthony, she differed from them in some ways. She believed, for example, in equal rights for everyone, not just people, regardless of race or sex or education. In their anger at the opposition, Stanton and Anthony both made really racist remarks, calling black people Sambos, black men Sambos, and saying many other nasty things about immigrants and the uneducated. But Matilda believed that all people should be able to vote no matter what. So in this split, it was Anthony, Stanton, and Matilda versus Lucy Stone. And here she is later on in life. She'd been eating pretty well by this time, I think, and she'd given up bloomers. And the differences between the two groups were that the National was radical. It wanted votes for women right now, and it believed in civil disobedience. And Matilda absolutely excelled at civil disobedience. She was just really good at it. Now, civil disobedience meant that women demonstrated, withheld taxes, and they tried to vote. Susan B. Anthony was famously arrested for voting in Rochester, New York. And this is the courthouse where she was tried and convicted of illegal voting. The judge said to her, "You knew you were a woman and you voted anyway." Anyway, Matilda covered the trial and wrote about it. She called the judge a small-brained man. This is a picture of my friend Susan, recent picture, standing in the courtroom where Susan B. Anthony was tried. Anthony's trial is the absolute biggest thing that ever happened in this courthouse. And if you look at the pictures on the wall, they're still all of men. "1875 was a great year for Matilda. She was elected president of the National Women's Suffrage Association. Her kids were all grown up. I don't know if you can see, I've got one of her kids blocked out here, but Maud, her youngest daughter, who had on a white ruffly dress, was still in high school, but her other kids were all grown up, but they were all still living at home. Anyway, that year, 1875, the whole country was planning for a centennial celebration in 1876. And the National began to make plans too. Matilda said, "The men alone of this country live in a republic. Women enter the second 100 years of national life as political slaves." So pretty clear what she was thinking there. Now, part of the celebration was that it was a huge fair, the first American World's Fair, that brought millions of people to Philadelphia in the summer of 1876. So in order to meet some of these people, Matilda rented a headquarters for the National Women's Suffrage Association. And they had lots of visitors. They had a book for people to sign, and they presented ideas that maybe the women wouldn't hear anywhere else. Matilda and Elizabeth Cady Stanton also wrote a Declaration of Rights for Women, and they applied for permission to present it at the national ceremony at Independence Hall, but of course they were denied. Well, that didn't stop Matilda. She and 5 other women from the National, including Susan B. Anthony, decided to present it anyway to President Grant, whether he wanted it or not. So think about it, even then, to present something to a president who didn't want it was kind of a daring idea. And they knew very well that they might get arrested. Access was very tightly controlled, but they got tickets and they waited in their seats behind the podium until the Declaration of Independence was read aloud. And then, rising from their seats, they stormed the platform from behind. And there were soldiers and ushers right there who could have stopped them. But these women were middle class, well-dressed, elegantly dressed. Everybody just stood aside and let them go. President Grant, for whatever reason, had decided not to attend the ceremony. So he sent the vice president, who's sitting down there, that bearded fellow, and they gave the proclamation to him, and then they ran out, back up the steps, throwing copies of the proclamation into the audience as they went. Well, the research for my book is based a lot on letters of Matilda that are in the Schlesinger collection, The History of Women in America in Radcliffe. And I call these letters the good, the bad, and the ugly, so you can see an example of them. On the right is a letter she actually printed to her granddaughter, so that one's easy to read. The middle is pretty typical, and the one on the left, I'm afraid a lot of the letters were like that. It took me months to read all these letters. But the one in the middle is my favorite. It's to her son, Clarkson. And she wrote this before the 4th of July. She was in Philadelphia, and she was leading a campaign to have the World's Fair be open on Sundays so working people could attend. But religious people wanted it closed. They did not think it should be open on Sundays, and violence threatened. So she wrote to her son, "Dear Clarky, I want you to bring my revolver and cartridges. Have them serviced first." Now, we know that he did come to see her in Philadelphia. We don't know if he brought the gun, and pretty sure she didn't shoot anybody. But I love that letter. Another way I did research was to read the things that Matilda had written herself. And in whatever year it was, 78, she bought a newspaper called the National Citizen and Ballot Box. And this became the publication of the National Women's Suffrage Association. She wrote a lot in this newspaper about the Indian culture that she admired. She published a lot of articles about improving rights and housing for working women. Many people in the movement overlooked working women because the movement was rather well educated and middle to upper class. Matilda also considered prostitution to be an economic problem rather than a moral issue. So she wrote about all of these things. And at the same time, Matilda, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony began working on a 3-volume history of the history of women's suffrage. Matilda and Stanton did the writing, and Anthony was the business manager. In 1881, Matilda had to give up her newspaper, which was failing financially, to concentrate on the history and to care for her husband. That's him. He was ailing, and his store was also not doing very well. But in spite of that, she managed to put on 3 fancy weddings for her 3 daughters in just 18 months. So this is her parlor. I don't have a picture of Helen, the oldest daughter, who was a school principal. She married a businessman. This is Julia, the middle daughter, who was a teacher, and she married one of her former students. And then the third daughter, her youngest child, Maud, married L. Frank Baum, whom we all know that name. At the time they were married, Matilda did not think too much of him as a choice for her daughter. First of all, she did not want her daughter to drop out of Cornell University to get married. She had spent years trying to get Cornell University to let women in, and now her daughter was in, and she dropped out. So she didn't like it, but Maud was just as strong-willed as her mother was. Frank was at that time appearing in a show that he had written and he produced. He wrote all the music called The Maid of Iran, and it was a traveling show. So for a time, Maud traveled with him. And he worked really hard to win Matilda over. He really did. And they came really to love each other. After Maud got pregnant, they went back to Syracuse, moved back to Syracuse, where Frank sold Baum's Casterine, which was an axle lubricant and a family product. In 1886, Matilda attended a demonstration at the dedication of the Statue of Liberty. Now, why would anybody protest at the Statue of Liberty? Well, it was because liberty was portrayed as a woman when women had no freedom in the United States. So the New York State Women's Suffrage Association applied to speak and to represent women at the dedication ceremony, but the answer was no. So the association rented a cattle barge, which was the only boat they could get, and sailed in the naval parade. The captain of the cattle barge had assured them that he would have it scoured before they got on it, but he did not. So several women were overcome by the smell and refused to board. But Matilda had a cow in Fayetteville, okay? So she wasn't deterred by that. Here she is on the left, they're getting ready to board, and you see there's a cow getting off to the far left. I love that picture. This is an illustration by Edwin Fotheringham for a picture book that Nancy and I have coming out this fall. Anyway, they sailed out. This is a real photograph of how it looked that day. And their boat got to anchor right in the front row, right under the statue. So here they are. This is another picture. The book is called The Voice of Liberty, and it will come out on September 15th. Well, their protest made the front page of the New York Times, so they decided that made it a success. That made it a success. In 1888, the National convened an International Council of Women meeting in Washington, and Matilda was one of the organizers for this event. This is the only picture I have of the 3 of them together. The left arrow is under Susan B. Anthony, the middle is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and on the right is Matilda. Now, at this meeting, Matilda met Frances E. Willard from Chicago, who was the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. She was a very charismatic leader in a fast-growing, ultra-conservative, religious, political movement. They wanted to put God in the Constitution and Jesus in the public schools. Susan B. Anthony didn't necessarily agree with these opinions, but she was willing to make a deal with anybody who would support women's suffrage at this point. And The WCTU had a huge membership, probably 200,000 members. So to make a deal with them got her a lot of votes. But Matilda really disapproved of this. She had worked all her life for separation of church and state. She believed that the churches oppressed women. And she called Frances C. Willard the most dangerous person upon the American continent today. After Matilda's husband died, she used to spend winters with the Baumes, with Maud and Frank Baum and their two sons in Syracuse, and they spent summers with her in Fayetteville. So here's a picture of Maud, her daughter, reading on the front porch, and Frank, Maud's oldest son, and again, he has long hair and wearing a dress, playing there by her. L. Frank Baum took this picture of Maud and the two boys, the two older boys. He was quite the amateur photographer. In 1888, Maud and Frank moved to Dakota Territory. So now all of Matilda's 4 adult children and their families lived in Dakota. Matilda still spent winters with the Baums in Aberdeen. Frank opened a store in this building, a famous photograph. And after the store failed, he bought a newspaper. And Matilda had 2 more sons. I mean, not Matilda, Maud had 2 more sons in Dakota. In 1889, Matilda could not afford to go from Aberdeen to the Nationals Convention in Washington, D.C. And Susan B. Anthony denied her funding, even though she had given funding before for officers to attend if they couldn't afford it. And the reason for this was Anthony had a plan. On the last night of the convention, when most of the delegates had already left, she pushed through a merger with their old conservative rivals, the American Women's Suffrage Association. And she created a new group, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Well, Matilda was furious. She created her own group, the Women's National Liberal Union, and she put on a conference in Washington, D.C. that was well attended, urging separation of church and state. But the group failed eventually because they just could not keep up the funding for it. In 1891, the Baums moved to Chicago, where Scott took us on a great tour when we met there a couple of years ago. And Matilda began to spend her winters in Chicago. She loved to take the horse car downtown, so there's a horse car. She called Chicago a spiritual center. Matilda was always very spiritual, always probably looking for an alternative explanation of life that wasn't religion. She was interested in phrenology, seances, palmistry, crystalism, and especially theosophy. In 1893, the Baums attended the World's Columbian Exposition many times. It was known as the White City, and some people think it inspired the name the Emerald City. That same year, 1893, Matilda was made an honorary member of the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation. So as such, she had voting rights in her Indian nation that she never had in the United States. Her most famous book, Woman, Church, and State, was published in Chicago in 1893. This history told how religion and government had oppressed women for centuries, and it took it right up to the modern time. So one example she cited was the state of Delaware, where that year, in 1893, the legal age of consent for sexual activity was 7. Matilda raged that a 7-year-old girl could not possibly consent to an act, this is a quote, of which she neither knows the name nor the consequences. Matilda said that this Delaware consent law was passed just to allow villains to assault baby victims. Woman, Church, and State is a terrific book. It's a really good read. I recommend it highly. Still read and admired today. Matilda donated a copy to, I think, the high school in Fayetteville, but to a school in Fayetteville, for sure. And a school board member sent the book to Anthony Comstock, who headed the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. Comstock condemned the book for what he called its, quote, Tales of Lust, and he threatened to bring suit against anyone who put it in schools. He didn't care about 7-year-olds getting raped, he just didn't want people reading about it. Matilda was thrilled by this. She loved opposition. Opposition always made her stronger. Now, L. Frank Baum was also writing at this time, and he was telling stories to his 4 sons. Matilda loved his stories, and she urged him to write them down and get them published. And she felt very proud when his first book came out, his first children's book came out in 1897. So it's fun to think of the two of them, her writing diatribes against organized religion and him writing fairy tales under the same roof, and then they both come down to dinner. You know. Matilda died at the Baum's house in Chicago in 1898. Her ashes are buried in Fayetteville. On her tombstone is one of her favorite sayings: "There is a word sweeter than mother, home, or heaven. That word is liberty." Liberty. Well, after Matilda died, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton deliberately wrote her out of history. And if you want to know how they did it, you have to read my book. One person who did not forget Matilda was her son-in-law, L. Frank Baum. Dorothy, as we know, is a brave, practical American girl. In the second book, The Marvelous Land of Oz, Frank spoofs women's rights, he spoofed every kind of political movement, but he also, in this book, makes Oz a feminist utopia ruled by women for the rest of the series. In the late 1960s and 70s, during the second wave of the women's movement, feminist scholars rediscovered Matilda. And in 1993, scientist Margaret Roster coined the term the Matilda effect, referring to the fact that male scientists often take credit for the work of women. Today, Matilda's house is a museum open to the public, so if you ever get to the Syracuse area, you should surely go. There are many connections with L. Frank Baum and Oz, and he got married in the front parlor. And they do welcome Oz fans. So although we've been celebrating this year the centennial of women's voting, today we still don't have an equal rights amendment for women. Women don't get equal pay for equal work, and they don't have the right to control their own bodies. And that's just in the United States. In many countries, women are still born criminal for wanting the most basic human rights, like freedom of movement or learning to read. So anyone wanting to change conditions for women would do well to study Matilda's life and techniques. She said, "The longer I work, the more I see that women's cause is the world's cause." She really was the voice of liberty. And I thank you. That's the end of the PowerPoint.
That's good. That's great.
Thank you.
Oh, it was great.
So, I'm hoping somebody has a question or a comment and I can get a drink.
I was a little surprised you didn't mention the in that phrase that ends, that word is liberty, the situation where it was used by someone else before, even though she wrote it. Wasn't that in your book?
Oh, yeah, Elizabeth Cady Stanton claimed she was signing autographs that way. And Matilda called her on it, and then she wrote something really snippy like, "All those autographs you should attribute to Matilda Joyslyn Gage."
Right.
And you know what else? I don't know if I put it in the book, but really that slogan was based on a slogan by Francis E. Willard, which was something like, mother, home, and apple pie, or the whole world.
Had to do with temperance, though? Temperance Union?
Yeah, but I don't remember
the original quote.
Yeah, I don't remember it, but that's where Matilda took it and adapted it from that.
Okay.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I have a question for Nancy. You all saw those beautiful illustrations that are going to be in the picture book, The Voice of Liberty, and the artist, Edwin Fotheringham, is so famous and well known in children's literature. I want to know, how did you get him to do that? It's wonderful.
Oh, I just asked him. He had a website, and I just wrote him, and I said, "Would you be interested in doing a book about suffrage, about women?" I can't remember how I asked it. It was kind of a clever ask, or so it seemed to me. And he wrote back and said, "Tell me more." And so we started a dialogue and came to terms, and he agreed to do it. So, and I think he just did a bang up job. The cow vacating the ship and all of it's just, and then the cover where you see the back of Liberty and the women holding up their signs. I think that's really unexpected and really works well. So I'm with you. I mean, we looked at a lot of illustrators as potential illustrators, and I kept going back to Edwin because he has a point of view that's just takes you by surprise, and I like that about him.
Agreed. The day those pictures came, well, I got preliminary sketches first. That was a really happy day around here, and every time I get something like that, I'm useless for the rest of the day. You know, just running around. Exciting.
Angelica,
Yes.
as an elder in an American, in a Native American tribe, what do you think Matilda felt? How do you think she reacted to that notorious editorial that Mr. Baum wrote in the Aberdeen Pioneer about the American Indians?
I wish I knew. I wish I knew some definitive answer. I'm a mother-in-law. I love my son-in-law. I think I would have said, "Frank, are you crazy? You know, what are you doing?" I would have had it out with him. But he was the editor, and I guess he took that from a lot of other newspapers writing too. You know, I mean, he was the only newspaper writing like that. But I imagine she was just appalled, and knowing her, I doubt she held back. I'm sure she told him her opinion, but I don't know. I don't think we'll ever know.
No, I don't suppose so. He was always a crowd pleaser, and I think that was a crowd pleasing editorial.
Mm-hmm.
Who said,
I'm not sure I agree.
really?
He was not into pleasing the crowd at that particular time in his career in Aberdeen. He was kind of fighting with everybody.
Was he?
Yes, he was. He was fighting with a local Episcopalian minister. They were exchanging, having sort of a testy exchange in the newspaper in letters. He was fighting with the local school kids. He was fighting with the fire department. I just don't think he was out to please anybody at that time in his life.
Well, those are authority figures. I don't call that the crowd.
Oh, but they were his crowd.
Were they?
He and Maud were part of the Episcopal, Episcopal Church congregation, and these were people from his part of the world too. There was a huge New York colony in Aberdeen.
Interesting.
Oh,
that's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had an answer for why he wrote that editorial that we could all understand, but I don't. I think he was being very clever, but it was a cleverness that fell short.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So
wasn't going to talk about that, and then I did. So.
Well, that's good. No,
Glad
that
you
was
did.
good. I'm glad you did too. That's very interesting. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Angelica.
Okay.
You put an awful lot of wonderful illustrations in your book, and you shared some in your presentation that I don't recognize from the book. For example, that beautiful street scene from Syracuse looking down the hill, just gorgeous. And in books and proclamations, newspapers. What do you have in your collection, in your personal collection of any of these things?
Nothing. I don't have anything. They're just they're all in my computer.
But they're amazing. Some some of them just, and I'm so grateful that you put so many nice clippings in the book, because reading the stuff around it was really interesting. Gave it perspective.
I was so grateful when we were getting ready. You know, this book was published as a young adult biography, but I think that even the Library of Congress didn't take it that way. They took it as just a biography for general audiences. But because it was young adult, or Nancy, you tell me if I'm right, because it was young adult, I said to her, well, how many pictures are you going to have? And she said, the more the merrier. And I agree with you. I think that really, really made the book so much better to have all those pictures.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why I liked it so much. If it was aimed at young adults, I had no idea.
No, it was good.
Well, it's very readable, and I think that's the key to it. But
somebody who noticed that it was for young adults, I guess, complained that I defined words like suffrage or something, saying I look down on my audience. But truly, I don't write any different for young people than I do for adults. It's just this book is a lot shorter probably than a traditional adult biography would be. So, hey, Bugle editor, what's coming up in the Bugle sometime soon? Anything about Matilda?
You wrote me a very fine article about Matilda in 2018, previewing Born Criminal, and I believe you're currently writing me a very fine article about Maud.
I'm hoping to. I'm a little distracted right now, but yes, that will be fun.
But I'm sure Matilda figures in it, and I'm looking forward to that for our winter 2020 issue. That's going to be really good. But I actually, on that same note, I wanted to ask you. You know, I really didn't know much about Matilda before I met you. I knew she was a suffragist. That was about it. But then I read your book and I talked to you, and of course we talked when you wrote that article in 2018. Back issue's still available, everybody. But I have students now of my own that aren't necessarily Oz fans, but they are very interested in the history of feminism, the history of women's suffrage. And doubtless I've given every single one of them a copy of your book. But where would you recommend they go from there, Angelica? What should they be looking at? What should they be reading to learn more?
You can read one book that's really interesting, although it's not very nice to Matilda, is Elizabeth Cady Stanton's autobiography, 80 Years and More. It's really easy to read. I mean, she's less, you know, Matilda sometimes gets a little Victorian and wordy. Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes in a modern kind of cadence. And then Sally Roche Wagner has a really good book out right now. I'm not going to get the title right, on the history of the women's movement. And it quotes Matilda quite a bit, too. And it's also very readable and fun. And she has she'll have a poem, you know, it's not just straight history. She'll have a poem or some doggerel or something. So I think those two are the two I can think of right off the top of my head, an old one and a new one.
Great, thank you.
Well,
Well,
I think we're about done.
This was wonderful.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's lovely to see you guys. I hope we
Good
get
to see
together for real next summer.
Oh, I know.
Bye.
Would you
Goodbye.
be willing to
Wow.
sign a copy of my book before we leave?
Sure, hold it up.
I hate this blank page. I
Oh,
thought we were all getting together this summer.
I
Yeah, I
have a
thought
signed
that's the
copy.
saddest thing of all. This of all the
Yeah.
things that got canceled, that's the saddest thing.
I know.
I know. Okay, well, take it easy.
Okay.
Stick with Oz. Bye.
Bye,
Bye, all.
Richard.
Hi, Angelica.
Bye-bye.
Nice to meet everybody.
Nice to
Nice
meet
to
you.
meet you. Yes.